The growth of military power and German ambitions for territorial expansion towards the end of 1930s spread fear of war all over Europe. The great powers attempted to strengthen their own security with mutual defence pacts. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union made a non-aggression pact with a secret extra clause which brought Finland under the Soviet sphere of influence. The Second World War broke out with Germany's invasion of Poland. At the beginning of October, the Soviet Union presented Finland with territorial claims prompted by the defence requirements of Leningrad. These were not accepted by Finland. Additional military exercises to improve Finnish defences were undertaken. Finland was able to mobilise some 300,000 men, 450 artillery pieces, 100 anti-aircraft guns, 20 or so tanks, and a coastal fleet based on 2 dreadnoughts and 5 submarines. The Air Force had 114 aircraft in its frontline squadrons. After negotiations had failed at the end of November, the Soviet Union revoked her non-aggression pact with Finland, and hostilities began on all fronts on the last day of November 1939. The main effort of the Finnish defences was placed on the Karelian Isthmus, where the Isthmus Army was formed. Most Air Force units had also been deployed to support this army. The material and equipment situation of both the flight and the anti-aircraft troops, subordinated to the Commander-in-Chief of Air Defence, Major General J.F. Lundqvist, was poor. At the outbreak of hostilities, the best Finnish aircraft were Fokker D-21 fighters, Blenheim bombers and Fokker CX Liaison aircraft. Other types of aircraft were too old for frontline operations. Fighter squadrons of the 2nd Air Regiment were formed to protect the lines of communication in the Karelian Isthmus and around Lake Ladoga if needed. Fast Blenheim aircraft with a long radius of action were generally used for reconnaissance over ground considered vital to the land battle. The bomber squadrons of the 4th Air Regiment operated in all sectors. Its mission was long-range reconnaissance and bombing raids in the enemy's rear. At the beginning of the Winter War, Soviet ground forces advanced along the entire Eastern Front with Air Force support. As expected, the main thrust of the Red Army's Soviet forces were halted on the Mannerheim line. Elsewhere, assaults were halted after initial successes. Violent battles developed along main roads with huge losses to the Soviet forces. Soviet air raids were mainly directed at objectives adjacent to railway junctions and ports in south and southeast Finland, as well as industrial plants such as Tampere and Jyväskylä. Helsinki experienced the worst bombing raid during the first days of the war. For Finnish fighter pilots, the first 2 months of the war were very successful. Air victories totaled nearly 100, with amazingly few losses of their own. Lieutenant Jorma Sarvanto's feat in shooting down 6 Soviet bombers in 4 minutes attracted worldwide acclaim. Attempts were made during the war to acquire new aircraft for the Air Force suitable for Finnish conditions. In the latter phases of the war, Finland had a total of 118 such aircraft. Most of the combat aircraft only came into service during the final phases of the Winter War, so their contribution was slight. However, the new aircraft severely tested the technical skills of the ground crews. By the beginning of 1940, Finnish Air Force activities had begun to settle down. Weather permitting, single liaison aircraft carried out reconnaissance and harassment missions. Bomber squadrons mainly carried out long-range reconnaissance and harassing raids to the east and north of Lake Ladoga. The fighter squadrons covered the rearward lines of communications and interdicted Soviet bombing missions to the interior of the country. A fine contribution to the air war in northern Finland was made by a volunteer Swedish unit, 19 Air Regiment, which from January 1940 supported the Lapland Army group fighting in the wilds of Sala and Kuusamo. This Swedish regiment was equipped with Gloucester Gladiator fighters and Hawker liaison aircraft. During the Winter War, the Swedish regiment destroyed 12 Soviet aircraft. After over a month of trench warfare, reinforced Soviet forces launched a major assault on the Karelian Isthmus. The famous Finnish Mannerheim line was breached at Somma in mid-February. Initially, the Karelian army withdrew to temporary positions, but on the 26th of February, the Supreme Commander was forced to give the order for withdrawal to the Viipuri-Tali-Vuokso line. This line was doggedly defended by the Finns until the end of hostilities on the 13th of March 1940. Vicious air battles developed in the skies behind the front line, with Finnish pilots downing about 70 aircraft in February. At the beginning of March, the last major battle took place in the Bay of Viipuri. In this decisive conflict, the CNC Air Defence gave the order to engage regardless of losses. In addition to bombers and liaison aircraft, ground attack missions were also assigned to fighters. In cooperation with the land forces, this threatening situation was contained and the Soviet attack was halted. The Winter War ended on all fronts at 11 a.m. on the 13th of March 1940. By their actions, the Finnish army saved the independence of the country. Together with anti-aircraft gunners, the Air Force inflicted Soviet losses amounting to almost 600 aircraft. Finnish Air Force losses in the Winter War were 62 aircraft destroyed and 63 aircrew killed in action. In making peace with Moscow, Finland lost the Karelian Isthmus, parts of Karelia around Lake Ladoga, parts of Kuusamo, Sala and Petsamo, some islands in the Gulf of Finland, and the town of Hanko and its immediate surroundings. However, the war in Europe went on. Germany extended her power northwards by the occupation of Denmark and Norway, and in May 1940 she invaded France. Only 1 month later, German forces had reached the English Channel. The Battle of Britain started, but Hitler was already looking towards the east. The ending of the Winter War did not stabilize relations between Finland and the Soviet Union. The Finns were left highly suspicious of Soviet intentions. When plans for a defence alliance with Sweden came to nothing, German interest in Finland increased. Finland's political leaders found that the only way to protect the country against the Soviet threat was to cooperate with Germany. Hence, for the autumn of 1940, Germany was to greatly assist the re-equipping of Finland's defence forces. In the course of 15 months, Finland's defensive capability saw greater improvement than in the 2 preceding decades. Plans could now be drawn up for an army of 500,000 men. The amount of anti-aircraft artillery tripled after the Winter War. Although the number of naval vessels did not change by much, the number of aircraft increased considerably. At the end of the Winter War, Morane, Fiat and Hurricane fighters had been purchased for the Air Force, as well as 1 liaison aircraft. During the truce, a squadron of Brewster naval fighters was received from the United States, and they proved to be the best fighters on the Finnish front at the beginning of the Continuation War. Germany sold Finland captured Moraines and Curtiss Hawk fighters. The state factory built Fokker fighters and Blenheim bombers under license, the first being completed in the summer of 1941. Soviet SB and DB-3 bombers and one 153 Stryker fighter, either captured in the Winter War or acquired from German depots, were reconditioned for Air Force service. At the outbreak of the Continuation War in June 1941, the Finnish Air Force had a total of 235 aircraft in frontline squadrons, although the variety of aircraft types, 17 in all, was still a problem. However, although the liaison aircraft and to some extent the fighters were obsolescent, the comparison of forces between Finland and the Soviet Union was more favourable than during the Winter War. The Soviet Air Force's main interest lay in Central Europe. On the Finnish front, the Soviet Union had about 500 aircraft. With the imminent threat of war, Finland mobilised her reserves on the 17th of June 1941. Fighter squadrons were deployed to cover the mobilization of land forces. A bomber regiment was located in central Finland, ready to support both offensive and defensive operations. Liaison squadrons were dispersed to the airfields of eastern Finland. Aircraft maintenance as well as the airfields themselves were improved. Germany launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941 with air raids on Soviet air bases. After centralizing the Red Army air arm, the German Air Force supported the thrust towards the Caucasus, Moscow and Leningrad. Finnish front, operations began 3 days later, with Soviet bomber raids involving several hundred aircraft against population centres in South Finland. Surprise attacks aimed at destroying the Finnish Air Force on the ground, however, failed. Finnish pilots hit back by downing 26 Soviet aircraft without loss during several air engagements on the first day of the continuation war. After these engagements, ground crew had the satisfaction of painting victory markings on the sides of their aircraft. The plan of attack for the Finnish army was finalized in the last few days of June. The Karelian army of more than 100,000 men was formed to counter the main thrust in the Joensuu area under the command of Lieutenant General Erik Heinsisch. This army was given the task of breaking through the Soviet forces to the east of Lake Ladoga and reaching the river Sver and Lake Annesjärvi. The 14th Division was to advance east from the Lieksa-Kuormo area. German forces in Norway were responsible for operations in North Finland. The Finnish Third Army Corps, located in the Suomi-Salmi-Sala sector, was subordinated to German command. Air defence of German ground forces was the responsibility of the 5th Air Force under the command of Colonel General Hans-Jürgen Stumpf. At the outbreak of the Continuation War, the Germans had approximately 100 aircraft at airfields in northern Finland. At the end of June, the Commander-in-Chief of the Finnish Air Force, Major General J.F. Lundqvist, ordered the Air Force to prepare to support the ground offensive. The 12th and 16th Reconnaissance and Liaison Squadrons, as well as 15 Squadron, which was assigned to air transport tasks, were subordinated to the Karelian Army, and 14 Squadron to the 4th Army Corps. The principal task of the 24th, 26th and 28th Squadrons of 2 Air Regiment was to provide air cover for the Karelian Army and 2nd Army Corps. At the beginning of July, Soviet air activity increased considerably in the area north of Lake Ladoga. Large fighter formations escorted bombers ordered to harass Finnish formations grouping for the attack. Fighter pilots of the 2nd Air Regiment scored several air victories in fierce battles in which the Brewster proved a fast and maneuverable fighter with excellent combat performance. The defence of cities, industrial plants and communications in southern Finland was the responsibility of 30 and 32 fighter squadrons of 3 Air Regiment operating Fokker and Hurricane fighters. 42 and 44 squadrons of the 4th Bomber Regiment carried out air reconnaissance of the Karelian Isthmus, the Lake Ladoga area, and attacked troops and resupply convoys in the rear of the Red Army. The 3rd Bomber Squadron, number 46, carried out long-range reconnaissance, but lack of aircraft hampered its operations from the very outset of the war. The Karelian army launched its attack on the 10th of July 1941. The attack was spearheaded by Major General Paavo Talvela's troops, who reached the northern shores of Lake Ladoga in 6 days and continued advancing eastwards in the direction of the coast road. The former frontier was reached, and the Supreme Commander halted the troops of the 6th Army Corps at the Tuulasjoki River line on the 24th of July. In the initial phases of the ground offensive, bombers made several reconnaissance flights to the northeast of Lake Ladoga and the Karelian Isthmus. Their mission, to gather information on Soviet troop movements and also to attack road and railway movements with their Blenheim bombers. In mid-July, bomber missions were targeted at airfields in the Karelian Isthmus in order to paralyze Soviet air activities. Fighters were given the task of gaining air superiority over the sectors involved in the advance of the Karelian army. Army forces deployed on the Karelian Isthmus remained in a defensive posture until the end of July 1941. On the last day of July, the 2nd Army Corps attacked on a 100-kilometre front on the eastern isthmus with the aim of reaching the west coast of Lake Ladoga and the watercourse of the Vuoksi. Army Corps troops broke through Soviet troops in fierce battles and forced their way through to the shores of Lake Ladoga a week later. Three fighter squadrons, one bomber squadron and one liaison squadron were assigned to support the offensive on the Karelian Isthmus. The fighter force covered the advance of 2nd Army Corps, particularly with the regrouping and deployment of artillery. Circumstances permitting, squadrons were also assigned ground attack missions. The bomber squadron supported the attack by reconnoitring maritime traffic moving to the harbours of northwestern Ladoga. Blenheim bombers attacked verified targets. The liaison squadron carried out both reconnaissance and dive bombing attacks on the eastern isthmus. Simultaneously, they were able to observe the shores of Lake Ladoga filling up with Soviet divisions withdrawing by boat through Lake Ladoga to the Leningrad area. In spite of air raids on Soviet airfields on the Karelian Isthmus, their fighter force retained considerable operational capability. In mid-August, 9 Soviet Saika fighters were shot down by Brewster pilots in the biggest air engagement of the offensive on the eastern isthmus. In July 1941, 32 Fighter Squadron, operating on the Karelian Isthmus, was equipped with Curtiss Hawk fighters. The Finnish Air Force had 44 of these American-built fighters during the Continuation War, and in early engagements over the Isthmus, Curtiss pilots scored 22 victories for the loss of 2 aircraft. When 2nd Army Corps moved to Ladoga, it was directed south towards the watercourse of the Vuoksi. Curtis and Brewster squadrons covered the crossings, preventing Soviet fighter penetration. First Army Corps, formed as a result of the regrouping of forces, captured the town of Sortavala in mid-August. Forces advancing on the west coast of Ladoga reached the destroyed town of Kakisalmi and the watercourse of the Vuoksi River at Taipale on the 23rd of August. Rapid Finnish advance threatened Soviet lines of communication in the Viipuri area. When Soviet forces began to withdraw from the Western Isthmus, 4th Army Corps attacked to recapture Viipuri. Air Force activities became increasingly directed towards support of the ground offensive. 2 fighter squadrons were assigned as air cover for the attacking troops, and No. 14 Squadron was tasked with reconnaissance. Fighters actively sought air engagements in the Bay of Viipuri, where the Soviet Air Force tried hard to prevent Finnish troops crossing the waterways. The Battle of Viipuri ended on the 30th of August 1941, and the Karelian capital was again in Finnish hands. Three encircled Soviet divisions were destroyed to the south of the city. In the Viipuri area, the Finns had their greatest victory of the war. While the battle for Viipuri was still going on, plans for the capture of the entire Karelian Isthmus rapidly unfolded. The Supreme Commander halted the advance on the outer defensive perimeter line of Leningrad on the 2nd of September 1941. At the beginning of September, the Karelian army was ready to continue the advance northwest of Lake Ladoga towards the River Svea and Lake Arisjärvi. Most of the available fighter squadrons, 2 liaison squadrons and 1 bomber squadron, were assigned to support the advance. Heavy preparatory bombardment by 16 artillery battalions, never before seen on the Finnish front, preceded the Finnish breakthrough. 6th Army Corps crossed the river Tuulasjoki and began advancing towards the town of Aunus and the River Svea. At the beginning of the attack, artillery fire was successfully controlled by the pilots of 12th Squadron. As the assaulting army advanced, Fokker fighters strafed withdrawing Soviet troops and motorized columns after becoming engaged in air-to-air combat with Soviet fighters as well. As long-range squadrons, No. 42 still operated east of Lake Ladoga and No. 44 in the area of the Karelian Isthmus. Due to a lack of reliable maps to support operations, large areas in East Karelia were photographed by Blenheim bombers. Reconnaissance flights were directed in particular to the Murmansk railway line and the roads to Petrozavodsk from the west. Such bombing raids often cut vital Soviet communications, and many trains were destroyed. A true blitzkrieg was being waged by 6th Army Corps. In 3 days, the spearhead of the attack had advanced 75 kilometers, the vanguard reaching the Svea on the 7th of September. The next day, the Murmansk railway line was cut. By October, the Karelian army had reached the shores of Lake Anasjärvi, and Finnish troops had spread out along the entire length of the river Svea. Then they turned north to the town of Petrozavodsk. Advancing ground forces were also supported in the wilds of East Karelia by air resupply. This was of great significance, even though the amount of material and personnel transported was not large by present-day standards. Only one Douglas TC-2, one old Fokker transport and a couple of small Junkers aircraft were available for the task. Nearly 20,000 kilograms of fuel, 2 radio stations and medical supplies were delivered to Colonel Lagos's troops advancing on poor roads. Wounded soldiers were evacuated on the return flights. During the ground forces' advance, liaison squadrons concentrated on the roads to Petrozavodsk. The closer they came to the town, the more difficult it became to operate due to patrolling Soviet fighters. When the air situation on the Karelian Isthmus had stabilized, the main part of 24 Squadron was relocated in the Ladoga area. On the 1st of October 1941, Petrozavodsk was captured by Finnish troops advancing from the west and south. The Karelian army was ordered to advance north and capture the towns of Karhumäki and Povensa with reinforcements from 2nd Army Corps. The fighter squadrons of 2nd Air Regiment covered the advance into Karelia. 16 Squadron flew reconnaissance and photography missions and harassed the Soviet withdrawal. The onset of winter and worsening weather interrupted flying operations, which gradually reduced on all fronts. While the main effort moved ever northward, 24 and 28 squadrons were relocated to airfields around Petrozavodsk. Karhumäki was taken on the 5th of December 1941, and in the freezing cold, Povensa fell the day after, in what was to be the last offensive of the Karelian army. The advance by the 14th Division, operating further north in the wilds of the Lake Rukajärvi area, was initially supported by the Air Force with aircraft from several squadrons. At the beginning of October, No. 14 Squadron, equipped with Fokker fighters and old liaison aircraft, was deployed in this sector. The squadron's mission was reconnaissance and ground attack in the rear of Soviet forces and to render the vast unoccupied wilds safer for Finnish troops. At the beginning of 1942, the first fighter aircraft of Western origin acquired by the Soviet Air Force appeared in the skies above Lake Ruukajärvi. At the same time, Finnish air defence was strengthened by a flight of Brewsters. Brewster and Fokker pilots scored dozens of kills in air engagements in the Ruukajärvi area. By the end of 1941, the Finnish army had attached its strategic objectives on 3 isthmuses, but the final result of the war would depend upon Germany's success. The Russian winter had ground the German offensive to a halt in front of Moscow and Leningrad. Despite German pressure, Finland stuck to her own objectives and held the defensive position she had already taken while awaiting the outcome of the Great Powers' War. On the Finnish front, a phase of trench warfare began, which was to last 2.5 years until June 1944. The most remarkable operation at this time was the recapture of the Hanko area and the island of Suursaari in the Gulf of Finland. Hanko was operationally assigned to 6th Squadron, subordinated to the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy and 3 Air Regiment. Flying units were reinforced by Curtiss fighters for the battles of Hanko. Towards the end of the year, a Fiat squadron was included in the regiment, and its aircraft participated in the defence of Helsinki. With the Germans advancing to the south of the Gulf of Finland, the Russians evacuated the Hanko Peninsula at the end of December 1941 and withdrew their troops also from the island of Suursaari, only to retake it again a month later. In March 1942, Combat Group Pajari was formed on the orders of the Supreme Commander and recaptured the strategically important island of Suursaari. The capture of this island, which dominated the eastern end of the Gulf of Finland, made it possible to effectively close the Gulf with coastal defences and naval forces. Combat Group Pajari's attack was supported by more than 60 aircraft. Although bad weather interfered with flying operations at the start of the attack, Finnish bombing inflicted considerable losses on the Soviet troops. In the spring of 1942, the Russians put Finnish defences to the test by mounting several offensives. But these Soviet attacks were repelled. Bad weather hampered fighter activities on the Eastern Front. However, efforts were always made to mount reconnaissance missions behind the lines in support of ground forces. In the early spring, air activity was quiet and the days were passed on monotonous standby duty and various other pastimes. In active periods, transfers from base to base, as well as the severe living conditions, strained the Air Force's technical personnel in particular. Aircraft maintenance had to be carried out in very poor conditions. Various ingenious devices were invented to improve the reliability of the aircraft. Air engagements and routine flying caused plenty of damage to aircraft, and this was in addition to the periodic overhauls which still had to be done despite the war. Major repairs were undertaken at field air depots. Additionally, transporting fuel and supplies, as well as maintenance of airfields and bases on the ice, put a great strain on Air Force ground staff. In the spring of 1942, a major change was made to the Air Force organization. In addition to the bomber regiment, 4 air regiments consisting of fighter and liaison squadrons were formed, with responsibility for the following operational areas. 1st Air Regiment, the Isthmus of Aunus. 2nd Air Regiment, Lake Arnisjärvi and the Isthmus of Marselka. 3rd Air Regiment, the Eastern Gulf of Finland and the Karelian Isthmus. 5th Air Regiment, formed later, was responsible for the airspace of southern Finland. In 1942, fighter aircraft were found to be obsolescent, whereas newer and faster fighters that the Finnish Air Force received in 1942 were insufficient to replace losses in either quality or quantity. The number of Finnish Air Force bombers nearly doubled in the first year of trench warfare. Number 46 Squadron was equipped with 15 Dornier bombers received as a gift from Germany. Soviet DB bombers reconditioned in the State Aircraft Factory and PE-2 bombers acquired later were allocated to 48 Squadron. At the beginning of 1942, bomber missions were little more than reconnaissance of Soviet rear activities in East Karelia and the interception of Soviet advances in the area of the River Svea. In the spring of 1942, 4 Air Regiment began experimenting with combined attacks by several squadrons against vital Soviet targets in East Karelia. Segetsa Air Base near the Murmansk railway line was bombed in a joint operation involving 21 aircraft with good results. During the summer of 1942, Dornier bombers photographed large areas of the Aunus and Marselka isthmuses and reconnoitred traffic on the Murmansk railway line, as well as newly built stretches in the direction of Archangel, along which the major part of Western weapon deliveries was transported to the Soviet fronts. Murmansk Railway and Sekitsa Air Base were among the primary targets of 46 Squadron during the trench warfare phase. In the summer of 1942, increased Soviet air activity on the Karelian Isthmus and over the eastern Gulf of Finland meant that the main fighter effort shifted once again to 3rd Air Regiment's area of responsibility. After improvements to air traffic control and command systems had been made, the Brewster Squadron was able to shoot down 39 Soviet aircraft in only a few days in August 1942, with the loss of only 1 aircraft. Number 6 Squadron, subordinated to the Navy, carried out reconnaissance flights in the Gulf of Finland and observed the movements of the Soviet Navy. The squadron, specialized in anti-submarine warfare, and racks were installed for this purpose on SB bombers and seaplanes to carry depth charges obtained from the Navy. With the use of this somewhat original weapon system, the squadron managed to sink or damage several Soviet submarines. The slow Ripon, Dornier and Hover seaplanes of 6th Squadron were used to cover shipping in the western Gulf of Finland and the Sea of Ahvenanmaa, and to control maritime areas. The onset of winter and consequent freezing seas made seaplane operations difficult, and so they were equipped with ski undercarriages for the winter. As the year 1943 drew on, Soviet air activity over the Karelian Isthmus grew more and more intensive. The reduced interception capability of the Finnish Air Force led to a re-evaluation of equipment and tactics. The main problem of the Finnish aircraft industry was its small production capacity. In 1943, 30 new Blenheim bombers and a few Fokker dive bombers were completed. Test fighters of the Finnish-made Murski fighter were yet far from complete, and the series of 49 aircraft was only completed as late as the end of the summer of 1944. Interception capability of the Finnish Air Force was improved considerably by the acquisition of Messerschmitt 109 G2 fighters from Germany to equip 34 Squadron, which had been formed in the spring of 1943. A total of 48 aircraft of this type were acquired, and later on 111 G6 variants were received into service. But the year 1943 was disastrous for the Bomber Regiment. In raids on airfields at Saketsa and on the island of Lavansari, which was carried out in bad weather, 5 bombers were destroyed and 11 damaged in forced landings. The losses suffered by Germany in 1943 on the Eastern Front hastened Finland's efforts to get out of the war. In February 1944, the Soviet Air Force carried out 3 concentrated air raids upon Helsinki with several hundred bombers in order to give an impetus to armistice negotiations. Due to successful fighter interception and anti-aircraft fire, only 5% of the bombs hit the center of Helsinki. The success of the Red Army in battles against the Germans also influenced the situation on the Finnish front, especially on the Karelian Isthmus, where the Soviet Supreme Command decided to break the resistance of the Finns by launching a fast and powerful attack in the summer of 1944. When the attack began on the 9th of June, Soviet forces compared to the Finns had a 6-fold superiority in combat troops, 20 times as much artillery, more than 600 tanks, and an air force of about 1,500 combat aircraft to support them. Against the Russians, Finland was able to muster some 70 bombers and 100 fighters. When the big offensive started, only 2 squadrons, numbers 24 and 34, were equipped with modern Messerschmitt fighter aircraft, of which only 20 were serviceable. The fighter situation improved as a result of the Ribbentrop Pact concluded by President Risto Ryti, which resulted in the delivery of 81 up-to-date Messerschmitt G6 fighters from Germany before the end of the war. Air support in the Karelian Isthmus was considerably reinforced with the arrival from Germany in mid-June of the Kulmi Air Detachment. This German flying unit, comprising some 50 aircraft, included a Junkers 87 Stuka dive bomber squadron, famous for its bombing accuracy, and a Focke-Wulf 190 fighter bomber squadron. The Kulmi detachment proved an extremely effective and devoted group in the decisive battles that followed. The Soviet Union began their major offensive on the Karelian Isthmus on the 9th of June 1944 with a tremendous artillery bombardment. This preparatory fire was followed by an infantry assault supported by large numbers of tanks and aircraft. Soviet forces broke through Finnish defences in strength at Valkeasaari. Number 3 Air Regiment flew Messerschmitt fighters to reconnoitre the movements of Soviet troops. Only small formations of fighters could be sent to intercept the huge Soviet air formations. Bombing raids by 4 Air Regiment were also aimed at the Karelian Isthmus. In mid-June, a concerted attack by 45 bombers on Soviet tanks in the plains of Siiränmäki and Kuutaselkä caused great destruction. In 10 days, Soviet troops were in front of Viipuri and retook the Karelian capital on 20th of June. In this serious situation, the Commander-in-Chief of the Air Force ordered 4 Air Regiment to conduct bombing operations regardless of losses. Fourth Army Corps, fighting the onslaught of an overwhelming opponent, was supported by several air attacks on Soviet artillery positions, tanks and troop convoys. Cooperation between Finnish units in the decisive battles of Taali, Ihantala on the Karelian Isthmus east of Viipuri was excellent. Soviet troop movement was detected by radioed reconnaissance. Messerschmitt pilots of 3 Air Regiment made several reconnaissance flights per day, and the information gathered from them was confirmed by photographic reconnaissance. Concentrated fire by the aircraft of the Air Regiment and the dive bombers of the Germany Kulmi detachment was directed with the aid of photographs onto targets minutes before the Russians attacked. In the last few days of June, the situation on the Karelian Isthmus in the Tali area turned critical when fierce Finnish counterattacks failed to restore the main defensive line. Once again, the 4th Army Corps had to withdraw to new positions which, with artillery support, were held until the end of the war. In the last phase of the Great Soviet Offensive, the primary missions of the fighters was to cover the bomber squadrons. Soviet fighters did not shoot down a single Finnish bomber. However, 7 were lost to anti-aircraft fire. The combat skills of Finnish pilots was proved by the downing of 315 Soviet aircraft in June 1944 alone, for the loss of only 16 aircraft. Fighter ace Warrant Officer Ilmari Juutilainen scored 34 air victories in the major offensive on the Karelian Isthmus. Air support was a decisive contribution to the final result of the Tali-Ihantala battles. Overwhelming Soviet attacks could be halted at the point of main effort by well-timed artillery and bombing concentrations. The Soviet attack, launched in the direction of the River Svir and Maselga at the end of June, was initially supported by more than 1,000 aircraft. The withdrawal of the Finnish Aunus Group and the 2nd Army Corps through the East Karelian wilderness was covered by the 1st and 2nd Air Regiments. When Soviet forces made a surprise assault across Lake Ladoga in the rear of Finnish forces at Tulos, bomber squadrons of 4 Air Regiment under the cover of Curtiss fighters were ordered to delay the Soviet landing on the eastern shore of Ladoga. At the beginning of July 1944, the Soviets launched an attack across the Bay of Viipuri, west of the city and across the river Vuoksi, with the aim of crushing the Finnish defences. A battle which lasted several days began in the Bay of Viipuri, resulting in the withdrawal of Soviet landing troops with heavy casualties. The Finnish Air Force began its last major battle on the Karelian Isthmus in the Vuoksi waterway area to fend off the Soviet attack. Day after day, bomber squadrons pounded the spearheads of Soviet attacks on Vuosalmi, where Soviet troops attempted to cross the Vuoksi River regardless of their losses. On the 11th of July 1944, the Soviet attack was halted by the determined resistance of Finnish forces. A few days later, the Soviets began transferring their troops to the German front. With the situation on the Karelian Isthmus settling down, air squadrons reinforced East Karelia, where Soviet attacks were successfully halted in various sectors of the front in July and August 1944. At the end of the Continuation War on the 4th of September 1944, the Finnish Air Force could be well satisfied with its performance. For more than 3 years it had supported ground and naval forces in many diverse ways. 2,800 Soviet aircraft had been shot down. The Air Force accounted for 1,600 of them. Finnish losses included 209 aircraft and 281 aircrew killed in action. The highest decoration of the war, the Mannerheim Cross, was awarded to 19 airmen for their bravery in war. 2 pilots, Captain Hans Wendt and Warrant Officer Ilmari Juutilainen, were awarded it twice. Finland ended the war against the Soviet Union, still independent, though having lost parts of her territory. Once more, Finnish armed forces had to be summoned, this time to expel German troops from Lapland, a condition specified in the truce agreement. Formation consisting of bomber and fighter squadrons also took part and supported ground forces in their battles until the end of the Lapland War on the 27th of April, 1945.